Got it.
Okay. Oh, I appreciate that very much. So, Joshua assembles them at Shechem, which is the place where Abraham had started when he first arrived there, summons them. They present themselves before God in some sort of sacred site. And now Joshua says to the people, thus says the eternal God of Israel. So this sounds very prophetic. He is God's mouthpiece at this moment. And it's very formal, right? Ko Amar Adonai Elohei Yisrael, right? Prophets often speak like this. And now we have a passage which likely is extremely familiar to you. In olden times, your ancestor Terach, the father of Abraham, the father of Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates and worshipped other gods. But I took Abraham from beyond the Euphrates, led him through the whole land of Canaan, multiplied him, his offspring. I gave him Isaac, and to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. Esau got Mount Seir as a possession, while Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. I'll stop there. I'm going to be going back. I wonder if you recognize this. I talked earlier about how biblical passages are used in the liturgy. This should be familiar to you, and it's not that long ago, from the Passover Haggadah, right? This whole passage, in the beginning, your ancestors, et cetera, right through, we're going to recount the plagues of Egypt, and all the way up to coming a long history of the Jewish people. Not all of it is in the Haggadah, but the beginning part of it. So just as an aside, why is it in the Haggadah? So the Mishnah teaches, and the Mishnah is the source of the Passover Seder. According to the Mishnah, when we talk about the Exodus, we are to be matchil b'gnai u'misayem b'shevach. We are to begin with disgrace and end with praise. It's a rags to riches story, right? That's the dramatic arc through which we are to re-experience the Exodus. Now, the question is, what does it mean to begin with disgrace? And we have two answers in the Talmud to what it means. One is from Rav and one is from Shmuel, two very important scholars. And I don't remember who said which. I think Rav is the one who said, you begin with slavery, because the state of slavery is a kind of disgrace, right? It's a low point. You don't have a lot of dignity in slavery. And so Rav says, begin with slavery, and you'll be familiar with Rav's opinion, which we actually often chant, Avadim hayinu lefaro b'mitzrayim, right? Avadim hayinu, right? So that's one way of beginning with disgrace, and then we'll end praising God. The other way, according, I think, to Shmuel, but it might be reversed, is to begin with this. To begin with our ancestors worshiping idols, right? And so the story, according to Shmuel, is not, we don't begin in Egypt, but we begin actually with Abraham's parentage. And our story is a story of moving from idolatry to faith in the true God. At any rate, that's why it's in the Haggadah, but we'll look at it here in its context. And God is now telling Joshua to recount the long history of the Jewish people up to this moment, beginning with Terah, Abraham's father, who lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. So Terach is an idol worshiper, and you may well know the Midrash. In fact, there's some people who think that the Midrash itself is in the Torah, but it's not. The Midrash is an attempt to answer the question of how it was that Abraham came to break away from the idolatrous culture he lived in and go at an advanced age, leave everything behind and follow God to the land of Israel. The Torah itself simply says, and God spoke to Abraham and he said, leave. But the Midrash wants to, not, rather than seeing this as a command, seeing it as coming out of Abraham's own consciousness of what's wrong with idolatry. So that ultimately, when God says to him, leave your native land, he's ready to go. So according to the Midrash, here it says Terach worshipped other gods. Terach was actually an idolater, not only an idolater, but an idol maker. He created these little statues and sold them to people who would then put them in their homes and worship them. So Abraham, according to the Midrash, sees people coming to Terach's store and buying these things, and he sees actually that impoverished people who barely have enough to eat are coming and buying these idols so that they can pray to them and hopefully turn their fortunes around. And Abraham is sort of outraged by this. His father leaves him in charge of the store one day, and Abraham takes a hammer and smashes smashes the idols, and then puts the hammer in the hands of the largest idol. His father comes back from the store and he says, what happened? My stock is destroyed. And Abraham says, yeah, the big one took the hammer and smashed all the others. To which Terach replies, that's not possible, right? It can't do that. And Abraham says, according to the Midrash, so if they have no power, why do you worship them? And worse, why do you take advantage of other people by selling them, right? So that's all an elaboration on the idea that Abraham is called. Here, we just want to emphasize that Terach was an idolater. And I think for Joshua, the point is, we come from idolaters, and his greatest fear, as it was Moses's greatest fear, is that the people will revert to idolatry, that it's somehow in our blood. But now this is again God talking. I took your ancestor Abraham from beyond the Euphrates and led him through the whole land of Canaan and multiplied his offspring, right? So Abraham journeys, and he does this immediately. He comes into the land at Shechem, and then he journeys around the land, right? And he's been given this whole land, and he multiplies Abraham's offspring and gives him Isaac. So we're now tracing the patriarchs. And to Isaac, I gave Jacob and Esau. I gave Esau the hill country of Seir as his possession, while Jacob and his children went to Egypt. So it's odd that Esau is mentioned here as we recount now in very brief terms the history of the Jewish people from its very beginnings as a clan. And there's speculation in the commentaries as to why. The explanation I find most compelling is simply that Esau, who is, after all, Jacob's brother, does not have a claim to the land, right? Because he was given something else, the hill country of Seir. Now, I'm not entirely clear where that is, but it is not in the land of Israel. And now Jacob and his children, and we don't even have yet a mention of Joseph, right? But they descend into Egypt. And then I sent Moses and Aaron. Interesting that Aaron gets a mention here. Ordinarily, we just say God sent Moses, right? But here Aaron gets an enhanced role. And in fact, it is, I think, justified in a number of ways, not the least of which is that remember that Aaron is Moses's mouthpiece when he speaks to Pharaoh. He's his interpreter. Moses is, he says to God at the burning bush, I'm not very articulate. He's begging off. He doesn't want the job. And God says to him, here is your brother Aaron coming, and you will be like his God, and he will be your prophet, meaning he will be your mouthpiece. And so Aaron here has a large role, and he does among the people, and you might remember that he's quite beloved among the people. At any rate, God then plagues Egypt with wonders that I wrought in their midst, right? So just a brief reference to the plagues, after which I freed you. I freed your ancestors from Egypt, and now you came to the sea, but the Egyptians pursued your ancestors to the Sea of Reeds. Notice that we don't get any details about the plagues here. Really nothing. That's not important at this point. What's important is the splitting of the sea. And they now have left Egypt fully behind and really can't go back. The Egyptians pursued your ancestors to the Sea of Reeds with chariots and riders. They called out, meaning your ancestors, not the Egyptians, called out to God, who put darkness between you and the Egyptians. This is not the plague of darkness. This is the cloud which caused darkness that was placed. Remember, the people are led by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. This is in front of them. Excuse me. It's in front of them. And at the point at which the Egyptians are about to overtake them at the sea, God lifts the cloud from before the people and puts it behind them. And I'm sorry, give me another second. So, brought the sea upon them. It covered them. Your own eyes saw what I did to the Egyptians. Well, not really, right? Because, I mean, there were people who were under the age of 20 who did not die in the wilderness. But by and large, these are the descendants of the people. And when it says your own eyes, it's really making an identification between the people and their ancestors. It's a little bit reminiscent of what we saw in the Passover Seder, right? In every generation, a person should see themselves as though they personally went out of Egypt. And I think here, Joshua, in God's name, is emphasizing that. You went out of Egypt. Even if you didn't go out of Egypt, you went out of Egypt. Your eyes saw what I did to the Egyptians, and you lived for a long time in the wilderness. I brought you to the land of the Amorites who lived beyond the Jordan. They gave battle to you, but I delivered them into your hands. I annihilated them, and you took possession of their land. Right. So here we have a reference to the kings who are defeated, Sichon and Og. But just as we don't get the plagues enumerated, here they don't get mentioned. They they seem to have been important. Remember that at the beginning of the book of Joshua, when the scouts come to Jericho, and Rachav, the harlot who shelters them, says, "We have heard what happened. We have heard what you did to these kings," and they're named, right? But here it's really everything is being put in the simplest possible terms, just a very brief summary. And it's surprising, therefore, that we don't get mention of that, but we do get mention of Balak and Bilam. So just to refresh your memory, perhaps, so the people, this is from the book of Numbers, the people are in the wilderness. The king of Moab wants to attack them. He hires, his name is Balak, and he hires Bilam, who is a well-known and very effective magician, called there a prophet, who will curse the people of Israel. And it's a great story. If you haven't read it, go to the book of Numbers, read it. It's very funny in places. Bilam has a talking donkey who stands in his way, and so on. In any event, I refuse to listen, right? Presumably, on other occasions, Bilam is actually able to get God to heed him, but here, no. He had to bless you, right? And in Numbers, we get a series of pronouncements in which Bilam seeks to curse the people, but his curses turn into blessings, right? Much to the chagrin and anger of Balak, the king of Moab, who has hired him and is getting the exact opposite of what he wanted. Now, the point was, I think, that Bilam would kind of weaken them, and then Balak would be able to attack them, but it didn't work. So why is Bilam, of all the things that we have, which are really barely referred to or not referred to at all, like the kings of the Amorites, here we get a real emphasis, more of a story. And I think part of it is Moabites. The Moabites are the ones who lead the Israelites into idolatry, the Moabite women. And that perhaps is part of it, because again, Joshua is very concerned about the people descending into idolatry. And you also see that just as God brought the people out of Egypt, God is continuing to protect them. And those sort of the idolaters and their agents are powerless. And so you cross the Jordan, you came to Jericho, right? So now we're back at the beginning of the book. And the citizens of Jericho, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites fought you, but I delivered them into your hand. So this is not what we've seen, right? Because this suggests that Jericho was filled with all these different nations. So commentators have different ways of trying to explain this. One is that Jericho becomes, a name which is associated with all of Canaan. It's the beginning, it's at the entrance, and so it's sort of everything in the land of Canaan, where all these people live, is kind of greater Jericho. There's a word for that, and Sindaki, so I don't remember how to pronounce it. But where one thing represents a whole collection of things. At any rate, that's one way. Other commentators attempting to interpret this puzzle say, oh no, there were representatives of all these people in Jericho. At any rate, Joshua, God's mouthpiece, is telling them, yes, and you came here and I delivered. And now we get a little bit of detail that we didn't really have. I sent a plague ahead of you and it drove them out before you, just like the two Amorite kings. Not by your sword or bow. We don't have this in the history. And certainly the Amorite kings, there is a battle. It's not a plague. And this may just be an alternative history, something which didn't make it into one of the things about the Torah is, even the book of Deuteronomy, certainly the book of Joshua, that we have a composite of sources. And this source wasn't there, but it's here. I've given you the land for which you did not labor, and the towns that you did not build, and you settled into them. You were enjoying vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. This is very similar to what Moses said in his farewell speech, where he warns them about this, that you will go in and you will have all of this, and you'll have a cushy life, and you'll forget me, right? And forget that it's because of me. And Moses warns them, and here we get an echo of that. Therefore, and now here, Joshua has finished quoting God, and he's now saying, well, this is the takeaway. Therefore, revere God, render service with undivided loyalty, put away the gods that your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt, and serve God. I want to emphasize "and in Egypt." So Joshua is saying that the people of Israel in Egypt were idolaters. And that is really striking. But the rabbis pick up on this. And there are, I think, one thing that they point to, and is pretty apparent in the text. When they are suffering terribly under the Egyptians, it says they cried out. It doesn't say they cried out to God, right? And you would expect, if they were serving God and loyal to the God of their ancestors, it would be a direct address, but it's not. And we have this wonderful rabbinic midrash. Why is it that the people of Israel are redeemed from Egypt by way of women, by the way? That's another emphasis among the rabbis. All right, somebody needs to mute, please.
From Friedman, Robert.
I don't know what's going on, but please.
I did it.
Okay, so this idea that the Egyptians were, that the Israelites in Egypt are idolaters. So the rabbis say they were redeemed because they didn't change their language, and they didn't change their clothing. In other words, they maintained a distinctive identity, though it wasn't a religious identity in that sense. And that's really interesting, I think. That midrash is really interesting. I think it's based around this idea, but it seems to suggest that just identifying as an Israelite, even though you're not serving the God of Israel, made you worthy of redemption. I think that that's the rabbinic idea. And the rabbis who are serving Rome, under Roman rule may have had their reasons for that. I think that in terms of the Torah itself, really doesn't suggest much of anything as to why they were redeemed, except, as Moses tells them later, because God had made this promise to their ancestors. So God was fulfilling a promise. It wasn't because they were worthy. And that's not inconsistent with the idea that they were idolaters. So here again, Joshua is very concerned with the people reverting to idolatry, and mentioning the fact, not only as we saw that Terah, Abraham's father, was and his family were idolaters, but even in Egypt, you were worshiping idols. So he says, if you are loath to serve God, choose this day which one you are going to serve, the gods that your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or those of the Amorites in whose land you have settled. But I and my household will serve God. So Joshua basically is saying, you have a choice, right? You can serve the idols of Terah, or you could serve the idols of the Amorites, right? If you choose not to serve God, but my family and I will serve God. So he's really making a stark choice. This is reminiscent of Moses also. Behold, I put before you the blessing and the curse, life and death, therefore choose life. You have a choice. Here too, you have a choice. And the people declare, and is in one voice, far be it from us to forsake the eternal and serve other gods. For it was the eternal our God who brought us and our ancestors up from the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, who wrought these wondrous signs before our eyes, guarded us all along the way that we traveled among the peoples through whose midst we passed. And then God drove out before us the peoples, the Amorites, who inhabited the country. We too will serve the eternal, who is our God. So their response here really mirrors in some ways what, according to Joshua, God is saying to them. Joshua recounts the history, and now they are picking up from Egypt, recounting the history as well. We understand we have an obligation. God did all this for us. And therefore, like you and your family, we too will serve Adonai, who is our God. And Joshua is really very unsure about this. Moses, you remember, at the end of his life, also is, oh, you're going to fall into idolatry. He's constantly telling them this. Here he says, you will not be able to serve the eternal. And commentators, classical commentators, immediately add the words wholeheartedly, right? So you won't be able to serve God wholeheartedly. You're going to be torn. God is holy, right? He's very awesome. He's different. He is jealous, right? In the sense of zealous, in the sense also of jealousy, and we see this metaphor really become prominent in the prophets, who essentially say the people of Israel is married to God, and they commit adultery when they go off with worshiping another God. And then we get a very odd statement: who will not forgive your transgressions and your sins. Right? So I think what Joshua wants to say here is, don't think you'll go serve idols and then you'll just be able to come back and it'll all be fine. There will be a price to be paid, right? Because you can't treat God so flippantly. You say that you're going to do this, it's going to be very hard. You're going to be tempted. Don't be tempted because God's not putting up with it. And here, if you forsake God and serve alien gods, and here he's back to if, not you won't be able to. God will turn and deal harshly with you and make an end of you after having been gracious to you. So after having been gracious to you, again, God did all these things from you, and then you're going to go and serve idols. God's going to deal harshly with you. And the people say, no, we will serve God. Right. Thereupon Joshua says, you are witnesses against yourselves that you have by your own act chosen to serve the eternal. Right. In other words, it's a covenant. You are affirming that covenant, and they say, yes, we are signing on the bottom line. So then Joshua says, put away the alien gods that you have among you. Apparently, even now, there are, according to this text, some idolatry among them, and serve the eternal your God exclusively. And here they say, this sounds very much like the language in Deuteronomy, it is the eternal our God who we will serve and who we will obey. On that day at Shechem, Joshua made a covenant. This is kind of a summary of what's happened and a fixed rule for them. And he recorded all of this. It says a book of divine instruction, but it actually says the Torah. He records all this in the Torah. So what is this Torah in which Joshua records this? So one answer is that we have the book of Deuteronomy, and this becomes an addendum or something that's added in addition to the book of Deuteronomy. There's another explanation, which I think is really quite interesting, which really goes to the question of who wrote the Torah, right? And this is the rabbis who are not going to say, well, a bunch of different, sources were written and they were all brought together, because for the rabbis, God dictates and Moses writes, right? So who writes the Torah? Well, God dictates and Moses writes, but what about the words, and Moses died there? Did Moses write that? And they look at this verse where Joshua records in the Torah, and they say, no. The end of the Torah, which describes Moses' death, is actually written by Joshua. That's one answer. And the other answer is, yeah, no, Moses wrote it, and he wrote it in tears. He was forced to write of his own death. Then Joshua takes a great stone, sets it at the foot of the oak, which is in the sacred precinct of God. So here there is some kind of tabernacle there, and he erects a stone. And this idea of creating, anytime there's a treaty in antiquity, they create these kinds of stone pillars commemorating it. And Joshua says, see, this very stone will be a witness against us, for it heard all the words that God spoke. It will be a witness against you, lest you break faith, right? So here it is. You've signed. Here is a copy of the agreement, as it were. This stone represents it. And now that they have affirmed this covenant repeatedly, God says you can go back to your tribes and to your allotted portions. And here we are at the very end now. After these events, Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of God, died at the age of 110. So here he's called Eved Adonai, the servant of God. Exactly the same words that were used about Moses. And in fact, the reference to Moses is at the very, very beginning of the book of Joshua. Here now, at the end of his life, having accomplished all that he did, he is given, in some sense, the ultimate accolade, that he was a true and faithful servant of God. And he dies there, and they bury him on his own property in Timnath Serah on the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. This is different from Moses. Joshua's tomb is known. Its location is known to the people. There was a real fear, it seems. Remember that Moses is buried by God, and it actually says no one knows where. Here, so with Moses, there was a fear that Moses, in some sense, his tomb could even become a place of worship. That Moses had that quasi-divine status, that, remember, his face was aglow and so on. Here, Joshua is God's servant, but no one has any illusions about him, and he dies and is buried. Israel served God during the lifetime of Joshua and the lifetime of the elders who lived after Joshua and who had experienced all the deeds that God wrote. So after Joshua dies, the elders of the community continue to serve God. Now, this already foreshadows the fact it's not going to last forever, right? But for now, Joshua's legacy is intact. And then the bones of Joseph, which the Israelites had brought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem. So this is taking us all the way back to Genesis, to the very end of Genesis, where Joseph is telling his brothers, I am dying, but God will remember you. God will bring you out of Egypt. And when you leave, take my bones with you and bury them in the land of our fathers. And so here we come to a kind of conclusion. We're back just before the Exodus. Well, actually not, because they're going to be in Egypt for hundreds of years, but we're back at the end of the patriarchal period. And they're in Shechem, and Shechem is the place where Abraham, the piece of ground that Jacob bought for 100 casitas from the children of Hamor, Shem's father, and which had become a heritage of the Josephites. Well, except that the land, in Shechem had already been sanctified, but here we're reminded of Hamor, and remember, Hamor is the one who well, let me leave it at that. I don't want to get into that. Okay. And then we get Eleazar, the son of Aaron, who is the priestly leader, right? So Joshua was the military leader. Eleazar was the spiritual leader. And he gets buried on the hill of his son Pinchas, which had been assigned to him in the hill country of Ephraim. Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. We have finished the book of Joshua. So I'm going to open it up, and let me stop sharing screen. I welcome your questions and comments on the whole book or what we looked at today. Yeah, Sandy and then Barry.
So, excuse me. Rabbi, you mentioned there was a part where the people were worthy, the Israelites under slavery were worthy of being redeemed. I think you said because their language, their clothing, they kept. Is that correct? You said something
Yes.
like
That, but realize that that's a midrash, right?
Okay. All
There's,
right.
there's nothing in the text that says that. And so the question is, where did they get the idea that that's all they did that made them worthy of redemption? And I'm suggesting that they get it perhaps, and they don't say, perhaps from here, where it says they were idolaters in Egypt. And if they were faithful to God, there would be no question why they were redeemed, right? The Torah says, well, they were redeemed because God remembered God's promise. But here the rabbis want to, sort of make another point about Jewish identity and the significance of Jewish identity and maintaining Jewish identity. And I think this has to do with the cosmopolitan Roman culture in which they lived. Go ahead, Sandy.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. My question was, I mean, if people are being brutally, people are being treated the way they were, why would they have to be worthy? I mean, why couldn't God just say, this is not justice, this is cruelty? I'm going to help these people.
Right. Because in general, in the world, the experience of the world, and certainly in antiquity, was that God does not intervene, right? God has pulled back, that this is an exception, right? And the question is, why does God make an exception here? People have freedom of choice, and there are consequences to that choice. And people make, bad choices, and other people suffer. It's the same question, really. I mean, with the Holocaust is even more pointed because it is the people of Israel. Right? But in general, we do not see God jumping in when faced with suffering. And therefore, though it's viewed as a kind of universalistic story, I think that the Exodus and the salvation there is very particularistic. I mean, it's a good question. I wish it were otherwise, but that's the assumption, I think, of the Midrash, and I think it's really the assumption of the biblical text as well. Now, the prophets, at least some of the prophets, want to go further. There's a wonderful passage in Amos, which says, where Amos is chastising the people, he says, don't think you're so special. I brought you out of Egypt. I brought the Ethiopians from Kaftor, right? And there's a list where it seems like God did redeem, right? I mean, the prophet's point is, you're not going to get a pass on this, right? You think you're a special people, and actually, he says, because of your special relationship with God, God will be even harder on you. The ante has been upped, right? More is expected of you. Okay, Barry.
While Moses was on Sinai, the people built the golden calf. I mentioned that because it suggests that the people were somewhat predisposed to creating idols.
Yeah. So
Maybe that the fact that they were idol worshipped in Egypt is kind of consistent with the creation of the golden calf.
So the story of the golden calf is a little murky, because Moses goes up on the mountain. He's there a very long time, and the people. And the Midrash says that they expected there was a time he was supposed to come, he didn't come, he was late, right? So, because they say, where is this Moses, right? And who's going to lead us effectively? And they build this calf, and on a certain level, it seems like the purpose of the calf is to lead them. The calf is, when they talk, also when they're talking about idolatry in general, at least in the book of Joshua, they're not talking about an idol that is to represent God. The golden calf seems more like an idol that is to represent God. And they were certainly familiar with such things. In Egypt, they had such things. It's not clear that the idol in the wilderness is an abandonment of God or a worship of some pagan God. Now, it's true that they want to cavort, right? But I'm going to just look at one thing real quick. If I can grab a homage, which, needless to say, I don't have. Oh, I can look at the Tanakh. Give me 1 second to look in the book of Exodus, see if I'm right about something. Let's see. Here. So when the calf is made, and Aaron, after they make it, the next day, I'm sorry, Aaron says, right, he took from them and cast a mold and made a molten calf. And they exclaimed, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." That's what they say, the people say about the calf. And when Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and he announced, "Tomorrow will be a festival to Adonai." Right? So there seems to be a sense, this is not pagan worship, but it is forbidden worship, because making any kind of an idol or a form of God is forbidden, right? And then we see that in the second commandment. So I don't think there's evidence from here that they were idolaters. But Joshua is clearly saying that they were idolaters. And more than that they were idolaters in Egypt, and therefore they could easily backslide into idolatry. And we do see in the book of Numbers, right, where the Moabite gods, they seem to be sort of ensnared in that and begun to worship the gods of the Moabites. So the case that they are predisposed to idolatry is very strong. I think it also is very strong in the land of Israel, because, the gods of the Canaanites are fertility gods in part. And it's really tied up with the fertility of the soil. And now they're in their land, right? And they need crops to be bountiful. And so the temptation there must have been great as well. Anything else? Any other comments? Anna, last one. I'm going to need to leave in a minute. Go ahead.
Right, there's not really time, but I seem to remember Shem being a very problematic area in the territories, and Jews were not allowed to worship there. Recently.
Oh, the Temple Mount.
No, aren't there graves in Shem?
Oh, that I'm not sure. I'll just leave it at that. Part of the problem also is that a lot of places which are associated with particular figures That's the place where so-and-so was buried. A lot of them are very questionable. The one that's not, by the way, is in Hebron, where it's absolutely certain that that's the place that's referred to as the burial place of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Barry, last one.
Well, yeah, I don't want to keep you.
Okay, so next time, the Song of Songs. All right. So again, as I said at the very beginning, what we're going to do from here to the end is look at a bunch of short books that are read in their entirety in synagogue, starting with the Song of Songs, which was read over Passover. And I hope to see you then. Have a great week, everybody. Okay.
Okay.
Bye now.
Thank you.